They never meant for you to hear this. And by the time it ends, you may wish you hadn't. In the spring of 1807, in the Bavarian highlands of Europe, 47 women were delivered to a convent whose name has been stripped from every map and manuscript except one forgotten registry. Buried beneath the Vatican, the place was called Sancta Stillatitia, translated loosely as the Sanctuary of Dripping Grace, a name so drenched in irony it bleeds through the pages like a wound. They called it holy ground, but what happened inside those walls was not salvation, it was silence. The kind of silence that only exists after screaming has been buried alive. These women were not witches or heretics. They were simply inconvenient, too intelligent, too emotional, too disobedient, too aware. They were accused of hysteria, which at the time meant anything from resisting a marriage to speaking Latin better than the parish priest. They were labeled corrupt vessels, sent away for cleansing, but not with prayer, with process. And that process began in the basement of the chapel beneath the pulpit behind the false confession booth. Beneath a stone slab that bore no inscription lay a descending staircase of ash wood and iron, 13 steps, cold as bone. At the bottom was the chamber where purity was not restored, but removed. This is not speculation. I am not offering theory. I am reading from the surviving fragments of the Sancta Stillatitia treatment ledger marked Redemptio Mentis, the redemption of the mind. It outlines a 3-stage correction protocol designed to reduce emotional volatility, behavioral defiance, and intellectual independence. The final stage was irreversible, called Mentis Silentium, total mental quietude. The convent never returned a single woman, and yet no one questioned it because the families were told they had chosen to remain in spiritual seclusion. They received letters written in perfect calligraphy bearing red wax seals, not with a cross, but with a circle. And within that circle, a single downward point, as if a needle piercing flesh. Decades later, during a private demolition under state order, the floor of the chapel cracked, and a hidden room was discovered inside. They found 7 chairs, each fitted with iron restraints, blood still visible in the channels carved into the floor, not from sacrifice, not from violence, from surgery. You see, the church in that era was undergoing a transformation, a war, not of armies, but of control. The Enlightenment had split Europe's mind in half, and the church was losing grip over what it feared most. Memory. Memory is the foundation of belief. If you can erase it, you can replace it. And so the church began experimenting not with theology, but with neurology, guided by a splinter sect of monastic scholars excommunicated from Rome, but secretly funded through royal channels. They believed the soul lived in the front of the brain, and that sin could be physically extracted. The tool was simple: a heated silver needle inserted through the nasal cavity into the prefrontal cortex. The procedure was said to relieve the patient of burden. What they meant was the burden of identity. Maria E. was 22 years old when she arrived at the convent. Her crime was refusing to marry a merchant twice her age. She was educated, fluent in Greek, and known for quoting forbidden texts in the village square. She entered the convent on April 6, 1807. Her name is the last written on page 1 of the ledger. Under her entry is a note protocol initiated 12 hours later. Her mother received a letter. It said, "Your daughter has chosen to commit her life to God. She will not return. Rejoice, for her soul is saved." It was signed not by a nun, not by a priest, but by a sigil resembling a surgical cross with the arms inverted, a symbol later found etched into the scalp of every exhumed skull beneath the chapel. The bones bore holes, each exactly 6.7 millimeters wide, centered perfectly between the eyes. Not one fragment of frontal lobe remained. Some skulls were opened, others caved, as if the pressure had come from within. This was not spiritual warfare, this was anatomical invasion. The church called it sanctification, but Ada, the young novice who escaped, called it silencing. She wrote of women who no longer blinked, who moved like marionettes whose mouths stayed open long after the screaming had stopped. She said one woman stared at the wall for 9 hours before weeping blood from the left eye. Ada fled and left behind 3 pages, which I now hold in my hands, and they describe something darker than mutilation. They describe what was left behind. The women were not empty. They were vessels. Something was inserted during the final stage of the procedure. Not metal, not medicine. Something unseen. The notes refer to it only as the voice in Latin vocem interiorum, the inner voice. But Ada says it was never quiet. Once the needle touched the brain, it began to speak, not to the priest, not to God, but to the woman. And she never spoke again in part 2. We will descend into the but by a sigil resembling a surgical cross with the arms inverted, a symbol later found etched into the scalp of every exhumed skull beneath the chapel. The bones bore holes each exactly 6.7 millimeters wide, centered perfectly between the eyes. Not one fragment of frontal lobe remained. Some skulls were opened, others caved, as if the pressure had come from within. This was not spiritual warfare. This was anatomical invasion. The church called it sanctification, but Ada, the young novice who escaped, called it silencing. She wrote of women who no longer blinked, who moved like marionettes, whose mouths stayed open long after the screaming had stopped. She said one woman stared at the wall for 9 hours before, weeping blood from the left eye. Ada fled and left behind 3 pages which I now hold in my hands, and they describe something darker than mutilation. They describe what was left behind. The women were not empty, they were vessels. Something was inserted during the final stage of the procedure, not metal, not medicine, something unseen. The notes refer to it only as the voice in Latin vocem interiorum, the inner voice. But Ada says it was never quiet once the needle touched brain. It began to speak, not to the priest, not to God, but to the woman, and she never spoke again. In part 2, we will descend into the final chamber where the priest who supervised these rituals vanished without a trace. His journal was found resting on a surgical chair, and the last line was scrawled in blood. It said, "I tried to silence them, but now I cannot silence myself." And the ink continued for 3 more pages without words, just lines drawn in circles tighter and tighter, like a spiral into something that could not be named. This is only the beginning of what the church buried, and you are now holding the shovel. The priest's journal ended in madness, but the madness did not stay on the page. It leaked into the stone, into the rituals, into the ground beneath Sancta Stillatitia. When the excavation team entered the sealed basement chamber in 1903, they weren't prepared for what they would find. They expected bones, dust, relics of an abandoned order. What they found was warmth. And that was the first sign that something was wrong. The air was not stale. It was humid, alive, as if the room was still breathing. The iron restraints were still bolted to the floor, but one was broken, snapped, not cut, as if something inside had torn free. One of the workers fainted when he found hair strands still tangled in the clamps. Another screamed when he touched the stone and heard something beneath it, a hum, soft, rhythmic, like a pulse, echoing from beneath the floor tiles. They were told to stop, but not before they opened a wooden chest, locked with 7 seals, and inside were the voices. It wasn't audio recordings, not written words, but fragments of letters, unsent letters written by the women themselves, recovered from beneath floorboards, behind bricks, inside mattress seams, each one dated between April and June of 1,807 each one, ending in the same sentence. I remember too much and I want to forget. That's where the church stepped in. They offered forgetting as a sacrament, as a blessing, but what they really offered was annihilation. Ada wrote in her final letter that the priest had changed near the end of the procedure. They no longer recited scripture. They began whispering in a language she didn't recognize. Not Latin, not Greek. Something older, their mouths moved, but the words felt wrong, like the air been around them, like the sound didn't belong in this world. She said their eyes darkened, not black, but voided, as if the soul had stepped out and left behind a shell. And the room itself began to change the world by Connoatius. Candles would burn without flame, shadows would stretch against gravity, and the women would scream at things no one could see. One woman named Elsbeth reportedly spoke in reverse for 11 hours straight during the final stage, and then stopped moving completely, her body still alive, her mind gone, or worse, taken. You see, they weren't just erasing, they were replacing every emotion. Memory, belief removed, was filled with something else, something that didn't belong to the woman, something that wanted in. And the priests believed they were conduits that, through the needle, they were not just performing surgery, they were opening a gate, not metaphorical, not symbolic, a real gate. Inside the brain, a passageway between the self and something other, Ada wrote. They called it the descent assault. Controlled fall into darkness, where the soul was suspended and the voice could enter, and once it did, it never left. By May of 1807, the rituals had intensified multiple procedures in a single day. chants echoing through the convent halls night after night, candles lit from blood, not wax, and the surrounding villagers began hearing things, not rumors. Not gossip, but sounds that traveled on the wind, crying, laughing, chanting in a tongue. No one understood animals, fled the area, crops died overnight, children spoke of women at their windows smiling without blinking, and always the number 40, 7 scrawled into dirt, into bark, into mirrors, sometimes written backward, sometimes drawn in circles. But it wasn't until June that the ground itself shifted a tremor, not seismic but spiritual. The altar cracked, the crucifix fell, and the head of the statue of Saint Cecilia twisted to face the floor, and then came the silence. Absolute no birds, no bells, no wind for 7 days. The convent was cut off, not physically, but atmospherically, like the world held its breath, and when it exhaled, the convent was empty. No bodies, no blood, no women, no priests, just a sealed door, the broken restraints, and the lingering scent of iron and incense mixed into something that burned the eyes, and every page of the convent's public record had been removed as if it had never existed. And yet one ledger remained, smuggled out by a groundskeeper who kept it hidden in his family for generations. It contains a list of 47 names, each crossed out, each labeled as processed, and beneath each name a single symbol, the circle and the point. And beside that one Latin word, complete as finished. But they weren't finished. Something unfinished was left behind. You see, the church didn't burn the building because of heresy. They burned it to contain what they had invited in, what had been born in the needle's passage, what had no voice, until it borrowed one. And now we begin to understand why no one ever spoke of it again. Not because they forgot, but because they remembered. And remembering was the most dangerous thing of all, because to remember is to awaken what was put to sleep. The Vatican declared the site cursed. The local government declared it sacred. Both were lies. It was a zone of silence, and no structure was ever allowed to be rebuilt on that land. Not for church, not for home, not even for grave. And yet people still visit. They feel pulled to it, drawn like moths to a light no longer visible, but still burning underground. A place where echoes speak louder than voices, where 47 names still ring out in soundless agony, and those who linger too long say they begin to hear it. Not screams, not chants, but a whisper inside the mind, not in your ears, in your thoughts. And the whisper always says the same thing: I am still here. In part 3, we go back to the final 3 days of Sancta Stillatitia, when the last procedures were performed and something went wrong because something refused to be erased and it fought back, and in doing so broke the line between memory and possession, and that fracture still haunts Europe to this day. The final 3 days inside Sancta Stillatitia were not recorded in any official document, yet the pages left behind by Ada describe them in chilling detail. As the rituals intensified, the air itself changed it, thickened with something unseen, not smoke, not incense, but something heavier, a presence that pressed against the skin like humidity, laced with grief. The stone walls began to hum, not with sound, but with vibration, a low tremor pulsing in sync with the women's silence. The priests no longer spoke scripture. They whispered symbols into candlelight and marked the women's foreheads with ash from unknown origins. Leora was the 42nd name on the list. She had resisted every phase of the procedure, twice breaking free of her restraints. Once dislocating the jaw of a supervising priest, she was labeled a carrier, a vessel too open to suppress, but too dangerous to release. She was brought into the final chamber, not a surgical room, but a sanctified vault deep below the second crypt, a place no longer supported by architecture, but by something else. The air, there was ice, but the torches burned blue, and the floor was carved with grooves, forming a massive circular pattern with no beginning and no end. They placed her inside the iron apparatus, standing, not lying, her arms suspended in rings, her jaw fastened with cloth, soaked in oil and salt. She trembled, but did not speak, her eyes locked on the arched ceiling, tracing the seams of the stone. And the moment the needle touched her skin, the humming stopped as if the entire structure was holding its breath. Then she screamed, not in pain, but as if something ancient had cracked open inside her. the kind of scream that doesn't begin in the throat, but in the marrow. The priest staggered backward. One vomited blood, another began clawing at his robes, shrieking the word return, return, return. Ada hid behind a velvet curtain and watched as the room darkened, not from shadows but from light being consumed. The iron glowed red, then black. The apparatus shattered and Leora collapsed, but her mouth remained open and something poured out of her. Not blood, not breath, but a darkness shaped like smoke, moving against gravity, coiling like it had memory. The vapor wrapped itself around the chamber walls, and where it touched the scripture, etched into the stone, the letters twisted as if rewritten by an unseen hand. The priests dropped to their knees, not in prayer, but in paralysis, one by one. Their eyes turned upward and their mouths opened, but no sound escaped. Only the same black mist rising from their throats, as if drawn upward toward the center of the ceiling, where it lingered, spinning slowly like a halo made of sorrow. Leora's body began to rise, her feet inches above the floor, her limbs rigid, her head tilted backward, and from her lips came a phrase not in any known language. Something Ada wrote phonetically as Naseret Harkul, followed by a final word spoken in a voice that was not human home. Then she dropped as if cut from strings, and the light returned. But nothing else did. No priest moved, no candle flickered, and the silence was not absence, it was occupation. By morning, the remaining women had changed. Their eyes remained open during sleep. Their bodies moved in unison. Even when isolated, their mouths whispered the same symbols drawn on the walls in charcoal circles. Spirals, teeth. One priest began to write with his own blood, forming verses that reversed themselves when read aloud. Another walked into the forest and was never found again. And those who remained stopped using names. They addressed each other as voices and shadows and hunger. Ada recorded what she could until the ink began to melt on her pages. She buried her writings beneath a loose stone near the garden chapel and fled through the servants' passage, dressed as a novice, but not before seeing what was left of. Leora, her body laid out on an altar, not cold, not still, but pulsing, like something inside her had not died, but changed. She whispered Ada's name and said the words, "Come home." Her voice was layered, fractured, overlapping like multiple voices, speaking through a single mouth. That was the final hour before the convent fell silent. The villagers heard the bells ring once, then nothing. No smoke, no fire, just stillness. And when they climbed the hill, the gates were open, the halls empty, the beds made with care, the walls scrubbed clean. No trace of blood, no trace of women. Only the faint scent of iron and myrrh, and on the chapel door, written in what looked like rust, the number 47 drawn once, then mirrored once again like an open eye. No bodies were recovered, no clergy were punished, and no memorials were held. The land was sanctified, not by faith, but by fear, fenced off, marked as cursed. And decades later, when surveyors came to test the soil, their instruments failed, hands bled without wounds. Their minds slipped into visions of a woman smiling through broken glass, whispering, "I never left." And that is why no church was ever built there again, and why every whisper of Sancta Stillatitia was removed from Scripture, because something was born in that descent, something that speaks in memory and moves through silence, something that only needs an open mind and an open door. Before the convent was ever raised in stone, the markings were already there, older than Scripture, older than Rome, older than the idea of salvation itself carved into bone, buried beneath chapels, etched onto the skin of women who woke screaming with languages they never learned in 1313 in the hills of southern France. A monastery was found burning from the inside out. There were no survivors, no explanation, no signs of siege. Only a single altar left untouched, and on that altar was a symbol, a circle, with a downward point identical to the wax seal found on the last letter sent from Sancta Stillatitia. The priest who arrived to cleanse the site refused to enter, and one wrote in his journal that the fire was still speaking long after the wood had turned to ash among the closest wreckage. They discovered a single preserved manuscript soaked in melted wax and human oil. The pages were written by a monk named Thomas, a man considered a heretic by the early church, who claimed to hear voices beneath the silence and saw shapes behind the light his writings described. Women arriving at the monastery from distant towns, drawn by visions of tunnels and blood and iron chairs. They spoke of warmth beneath cold stone and lights that sang when they closed their eyes. They were dismissed as mad, until the humming began, a sound low and constant, vibrating through the walls like the stones themselves were whispering back at them. Tomas recorded his descent into the cellars, where he claimed to find rooms that hadn't been built by men. They were too smooth, too exact shaped in curves that made the eye ache, as if the body understood something the mind refused to process. He described a chamber without corners, where all sound died, and in the center of that room, a woman stood motionless, her feet not touching the floor, her mouth open, her eyes rolled upward, and though no breath escaped, the air around her pulsed as if something was speaking through her skin. And when he reached out to touch her shoulder, he said the ground moaned and the walls bent inward, and for one moment, everything disappeared, except for the sound of his own name, whispered in a voice that belonged to no living thing. And when he awoke, the woman was gone. The chamber was sealed, and his hands were burned in the shape of the mark that would later reappear in Bavaria 400 years later in the stone beneath the chapel where 47 women disappeared. The church declared Tomas a lunatic, excommunicated his order, and burned the rest of the monastery, but the manuscript was never destroyed. It passed through generations, hidden in libraries, disguised as psalms sealed behind false bindings. Those who read it claimed it was cursed, not because it brought death, but because it opened something in the mind, something that never closed. One woman who translated the manuscript by hand wrote that she could no longer sleep because her dreams began before her eyes closed. And in those dreams was the voice always closer, always hungrier. And each morning the mark would reappear on her window, traced in condensation as if breathed there from the outside. The pattern repeated every few generations. The same structure always returns: a place of silence, a gathering of women rituals disguised as treatment, music, humming like memory, and always the presence just beyond the veil asking to be let in. Not with force, but with permission. And the phrase "I open willingly" appears across centuries, written in dead languages, painted in blood on stones no one claims to own, etched into the walls of hospitals, prisons, sanctuaries, wherever the lost are gathered and their names forgotten. In 1807, that phrase appeared beneath the altar at Sancta Stillatitia, carved into stone, inverted, mirrored, and written in spiral formation around the iron frame where women were brought for the final stage of the ritual. Ada described it not as a sentence, but as a doorway. She said when the phrase was completed, the air itself shifted, the gravity bent, and everything around her became heavy with breath. Not hers, not the priests, not the women, something else. Something waiting, and the whisper that followed had no direction. It came from behind her, above her, inside her, a vibration that bypassed the ear and settled in the spine. She called it the interior voice, the one that doesn't speak in words, but in knowing, and once you hear it, once you feel it, it is never quiet again. This was never about correction, it was about preparation, not sanctification, but transformation. Each woman was seen not as a patient, but as a gate, and each ritual was a key. The church did not bless this practice, but neither did they stop it. They watched from behind veils, funded the structures, provided the tools, and when the voice began to reach back through the cracks, they turned away and labeled it heresy, while keeping the blueprints and the symbols tucked away in their forbidden archives behind steel and fire, where only the most trusted hands were allowed to read, and those who did rarely spoke again. And when they did, they whispered only one word: silence. The silence that followed the rituals inside Sancta Stillatitia was not stillness, it was occupation. The priests who remained after the final entries in the ledger wrote nothing. They spoke even less. Their eyes became unfocused. Their steps no longer led them to worship, but to shadow. And Father Marin, the last voice of order among them, began to feel the walls. Watching him, the stones no longer echoed footsteps. They swallowed them. The candles no longer flickered. They leaned toward the floor as if drawn downward by something no light could touch. And at the center of the lower chamber where the rituals had once been performed, the iron frame returned, not rebuilt, not repaired, simply there again, unbroken, unbent, resting in the same circular space, now scorched black at the edges and marked with claw-like scratches too wide for human hands. He tried to bless the chamber again, but the oil would not stick. It slid from the walls like water from flesh. The scripture he whispered dissolved on his tongue. His prayers returned to him in fragments. The names of saints fell apart. Crucifix above the altar split down the center, and behind it, a crack formed in the wall, wide enough for breath, but not for light. From inside it came a low murmur, a voice without shape or tone, like air folding inside itself, and with it came, and the smell of something sweet, rotting, fruit and myrrh, mixed with wet earth like soil, unearthed too soon from a grave not yet settled. And when he placed his hand against the stone, it pulsed once slowly, like a heartbeat, waiting for rhythm. The women no longer responded to their names. They stood in rows in the chapel, with hands clasped behind their backs, lips slightly parted, humming together a note so low it rattled glass but did not break it. Their eyes tracked nothing. Their skin grew pale as marble, and their veins darkened until they formed spirals beneath the surface like vines or veins that had been rerouted. And every night they returned to the basement without being led and circled the iron frame, whispering a word that was never recorded, never repeated by the priests who heard it only once before they began screaming and tearing at their ears to remove it. One priest drowned himself in the well after carving the number 47 into his chest backwards. His body was never retrieved. Marin tried to seal the chamber permanently. He dragged the stone benches over the stairwell. He blocked the passage with sacramental texts, doused them in ash, and sealed the door with melted gold. But the next morning it was open again, the air warm, the iron frame humming with vibration, and the spirals had returned, carved into the stone floor deeper than before, with a fluid precision that no human hand could manage in a single night. And that morning, Marin found the ledger, the precision, last page filled with names, not of the women, but of visitors, none of whom had ever been recorded as entering the convent. Their handwriting identical, each name written once in ink and once in blood, their origins unknown, their endings unlisted. He collapsed the stairwell with his own hands, one brick at a time, tearing mortar with tools blessed in fire and salt. But the deeper he dug, the louder the humming became, until he claimed he could hear it in his own blood, feel it in the pressure behind his eyes. And when the final brick gave way, the air that escaped was not stale. It was hot, wet, and whispering, and it spoke in a voice that matched his own, but reversed, saying the words "come home" again and again and again, until he drove the hammer through the altar, splitting it in two, and the floor buckled beneath him and swallowed the remnants of the ritual into the earth, leaving behind only dust and a smell of rust and roses. The convent above was found abandoned the next morning. The villagers said the bells had not rung, they had shattered in their cradles. No bodies were discovered, only robes laid neatly beside mirrors that reflected rooms no longer visible, and on the walls, the same spiral etched with fingernails in perfect symmetry, beginning from where the heart would be and spinning outward in a slow curve toward the doorway, and no footprints led away from the site, not even birds would land. The air refused to carry sound, and those who entered without permission spoke less each day until silence took root in their bones, and they stopped sleeping altogether. And when they closed their eyes, they heard it. Not words, not music, something beneath. Both a vibration that shaped their dreams into doors without rooms behind them. One journal was found near the edge of the property. Its pages warped, its ink melted, it read, "I tried to bless the floor, but the floor blessed me instead. And now I belong to the stone, and the stone belongs to her, and she remembers every name. And every needle and every voice that passed through the iron, and each one is still speaking inside her, louder now, clearer, and she is not done, she is not finished, she is becoming." The convent was erased from the records, but something beneath its ruins refused to sleep. The ground where Sancta Stillatitia once stood remained untouched for decades, overgrown with thorn vines that bloomed out of season, and animals that approached its border were found disoriented, limping, their eyes wide, their bodies trembling, as if something had passed through them, something that didn't leave when they ran. The locals called it hollow soil, a place where prayers went to die. A place where echoes returned before the voice that made them, and beneath it, all the stone chambers sealed by Marin's final breath waited, pulsing quietly. Beneath the moss and the roots, like a heart turned sideways. In 1894, 200 miles away, a hospital was constructed over the ruins of a 12th century monastery in southern Wales. The monastery had burned under mysterious circumstances. The only remnants were a spiral staircase in the Place of Dot-Com, eastern cellar, and a blackened crucifix buried in soot. The hospital was built with modern materials with strict blueprints. No sacred symbols, no crosses, no chapels, Only steel, brick, glass, and an ambition to reform mental treatment through isolation chambers and chemical sedation. It opened in spring, and by winter 17, patients had drawn the same symbol on the walls, a circle with a downward point. One had carved it into her chest during a fit of what doctors called religious delirium. Another traced it into the condensation on her window every night for 7 days without breaking eye contact with the moon. And each time she whispered the same name, Leora, a name she had never heard and that no one had. The hospital recognized. The staff dismissed the incidents until one patient escaped her room and wandered into the basement, where she found a wooden door sealed behind crates and rusted shelves. It had no handle, only a seam running down the middle and a single mark carved where the knob should have been the spiral. When they opened it, they found a staircase leading down into stone, much older than the hospital, much colder, and at the bottom, a room that was not on any blueprint. Its walls curved, its air warm, its floor perfectly smooth except for one detail, the iron ring in the center bolted to the ground and humming softly when touched. They sealed the room again, poured concrete over the entrance, but the drawings continued. Patients who had never met began speaking in identical tones, rhythmic phrases, spoken while asleep, while sedated, while staring into corners, and one doctor recorded an interview with a patient who described being pulled downward through dreams of red corridors, spiraling tunnels, and voices that laughed in circles. The recording lasted 27 minutes and ended with the doctor speaking in the patient's voice while the patient screamed into her hands, blood pouring from her ears. The tape was confiscated, sent to a private archive, and never returned. In the following months, the spiral began appearing on the floors in the dust, in the stains of spilled tea, in the grain of wood, and even in the iris of one woman's eye, documented in a photograph. The doctors began resigning one by one, and those who remained stopped using the basement completely. One night, a janitor named Michael Harris vanished during routine cleaning. The only trace he left was a single phrase scrawled across the break room mirror. I saw her reflection, but not my own. And below it, a crude drawing of a woman without a face, her mouth wide open, her hands covering her ears and her hair made of lines, looping inward toward a black circle in the center. The hospital was closed in 1901, 7 years after it opened, declared structurally unsound and spiritually unstable by the local diocese. Even though it had no religious affiliation, 3 workers who helped tear it down refused to speak of what they found. Below the eastern wing, one of them disappeared. 2 weeks later, his house found empty, his walls covered in spirals drawn with burned matches. One message repeated in every room: 47 is not the number, it is the gate. The floor was salted and sealed, but those who walk over it say they feel a vibration in the soles of their feet, a hum that rises when the wind dies, and the name Leora whispered in a voice that sounds like their own. There was no official investigation, no published records, no church involvement. On paper, it never happened. But those who live near the ruins tell stories of women seen in the fields, barefoot, with mouths open, as if singing to something below the soil. No sound ever comes from them, and when spoken to, they vanish behind the nearest tree. And one man swears he followed one of them, only to find himself back at his doorstep 3 hours later with dried blood beneath his fingernails, and a name he could not remember scratched into the palm of his hand. The spiral drawn with bone dust around the edge. What happened beneath that hospital was not an extension of the convent. It was its echo. A second ring of the same sound passing through time, through memory, through places built to forget, and every layer adds weight. Every repetition tightens the circle, and the spiral does not fade. It deepens, and the voice does not stop, it waits. When the hospital was sealed, the ground did not go silent. It only grew still, like an eye half closed, watching from beneath the crust of memory, waiting for breath to return to stone. In 1922, a team of surveyors sent to chart soil density near the old foundation reported their instruments malfunctioning, levels dropping unexpectedly, electromagnetic fields rising without source. Their readings formed a pattern invisible to the eye, but clear to the machines, a spiral. Centered beneath the earth where the chamber had been, and at its heart was warmth, like something breathing where there should have only been rock. The lead surveyor, Albert Reese, recorded the findings in a private journal. He noted the soil pulsing under his boots like veins in a living thing. He stayed late that evening to recheck the measurements alone and never returned. Others found his recorder still running, placed gently on the forest floor. His final words, mumbled through static, said, I hear her humming inside my lungs. They listened to it once, then buried the tape beneath a cedar tree planted across, above it, and left without ever returning. The journal remained in a sealed drawer of a university archive marked with a symbol. No one could translate until 1965, when it reappeared in a letter sent anonymously to a professor of neurotheology, with a single phrase scribbled in the margins: not forgotten, just remembering. In 1933, a girl named Clara in the outskirts of Berlin began drawing spirals into the frost of her bedroom window every morning. One more layer than the day before her parents dismissed it as imagination until she stopped responding to her name and began speaking only in mirror phrases, words said backward through laughter and weeping. When questioned, she would stare for hours at the floor and whisper, "Leora isn't sleeping yet." The doctor who treated her vanished 2 months later. His final note scribbled in the margins of her file: "I saw her mouth open, but her scream was still inside." She was sent to an asylum where within weeks 12 other patients began, always lit by candles that did not flicker, always ending in a door that opened by itself and behind the door. Not fire, not demons, but a presence in the shape of a woman without eyes, whose mouth opened wider than should be possible and whose voice could not be heard but was known. And every subject woke with the name Leora written into the sweat on their palms, as if drawn from the inside outward. One researcher attempted to go deeper using chemical sleep to prolong the dream. He never returned to waking. Not fully, his eyes opened, his body moved, but he no longer recognized himself. He spoke in reverse, he wrote in spirals, he wept, constantly from only one eye, and claimed that God was a sound, not a name. And the sound was no longer alone. They sealed him in a chamber, padded with symbols from 7 dead languages, burned his notes, and silenced the project. But the images leaked into art, into music, into architecture, strange towers built in places with no history of design. Like them, doors sealed without frame, windows shaped like eyes, and in their shadow, people began to forget hours, moments, entire days, falling through cracks in thought like sand through bone. This was no longer isolated, this was no longer regional. It had spread through the spiral like breath through lungs, a pattern with intent but no face, and those who tried to chart it went blind. Those who mapped the symbols found them mirrored on their skin in bruises and burns, and those who listened too closely began to hum, without knowing why, began to see reflections that moved slower than their own. And in every mirror where the voice had passed, there was always one detail wrong, a smile slightly too wide, a blink that came too late, or a face that did not belong to them, watching from behind their own eyes. The voice did not want to be heard, it wanted to be remembered, and every mark, every name, every sound left behind was not a warning. It was a doorway left ajar, just enough for breath to pass through, just enough for silence to be filled. Every time the spiral was drawn, the door opened just a little more, and each time someone followed the memory, they did not return as they were, because the spiral does not close, it only tightens. By 1954, the pattern was no longer hidden. The spiral began appearing in places untouched by history or scripture, scratched into playgrounds, drawn in frost on apartment windows, etched into the condensation of mirrors in buildings, never consecrated by any church. It appeared without instruction, through hands that didn't know what they were doing, and mouths that whispered words in dreams not their own. A child in Detroit painted the spiral onto her ceiling using only her fingers and ash from a fireplace that had not been lit in weeks. When asked what it meant, she smiled without blinking and said, "It's where the prayers go when God won't take them." She stopped speaking after that and began humming low and slow and constant enough that her parents heard it even when she wasn't in the room, even after she was sent away. That same year, a woman in Scotland reported hearing humming beneath her floorboards. Her home had been built over the ruins of a burned chapel. She claimed the sound was soft at first like breath, then rising over weeks into music. She couldn't place music with no melody, only rhythm, as if the house itself were remembering something it had buried long ago. She began writing spirals in her sleep, found pages full of loops drawn in red pen. She didn't own her handwriting, not her own, the name Leora, written between every line. She sealed the room where it began. She prayed over the door, she fled the house, and never returned. But the new owners reported the same sound within a week, and photographs taken in the basement showed orbs shaped like open mouths. Mouths too wide, too silent, too hollow to be human. In a school in rural New York, a student collapsed while drawing in chalk on the playground. Her teacher found her body convulsing, her hands locked in a pattern, carving the spiral into the dirt with her nails beneath her shirt. The number 47 had been drawn across her stomach in ink invisible under daylight, but visible through infrared. The class had not been taught any scripture. The name Sancta Stillatitia was not known. Within 2 months, 4 other children began speaking backwards in unison, their voices matching tone and rhythm. And when asked what they were doing, they said, "We're practicing the words from the basement. There was no basement." A psychiatric nurse in Italy documented a cluster of patients. Speaking of a woman who lives under the ground but not in dirt, in thought, they described her as having no face, only a mouth shaped like memory and eyes that blinked with sound. They each drew her home as a circle with a point at the center. They said the point was where she got in and the circle was how she stayed. The nurse took the drawings to a priest who burned them, but the ashes clung to his hands and hours. Later, he was found in the chapel laughing into the walls, carving the same spiral into his chest with the sharpened end of a broken crucifix. None of this was connected publicly. No news coverage, no investigation, no recognition, only silence spread by design. The few who tried to speak found their voices stolen, not by censorship, but by something deeper. One journalist researching religious disappearances was found in his apartment, surrounded by red string, forming a single giant spiral around his body. One hand gripped a recording device that played only static beneath it. A voice, barely audible, repeated the phrase, "She sees through everything you forget," and the lights in the apartment flickered in sync with his breathing, even though he was no longer alive. What was once hidden beneath a convent had become thought itself. Not possession, not madness, something else. A slow weaving of memory and sound and symbol. A whisper layered under everything, waiting for resonance, and wherever trauma had cracked a mind open wide enough, the voice would enter gently. It didn't scream, it didn't force it, hummed and waited, and once it was heard, it never left. Those affected began to see things, not shadows, not ghosts, but moments. Moments that did not belong to them. Memories of stone steps and iron chairs and voices calling names they had never had. They would weep at songs they didn't know speak, prayers from churches they had never entered. They would wake with blood on their fingers and spirals in their bed sheets, and their reflections would smile a second too late. Their mouths would move in silence when no one was watching, and always they knew what it meant. It meant they had remembered too much, and that remembering was the final act before descent. The spiral was not a symbol, it was a mechanism, a winding key inside the mind, and each loop another step downward toward something that never forgot, toward a presence that had waited patiently behind every chapel door, behind every hymn and sermon and sacred rite, until the day someone opened themselves wide enough to be a doorway. In 1961, a cathedral in northern Spain was scheduled for restoration. Its crypt had been sealed for over a century after flooding damaged. The foundation the team sent to clear the lower passage reported tools going missing, lights, flickering sound, behaving strangely, footsteps echoing twice, as if someone followed at a delay. The deeper they went, the colder it became, until one worker found a stone wall different in color and texture from the other, smooth, almost polished, with a faint spiral carved into its center. He touched it and screamed, dropped to his knees, holding his head, blood dripping from his nose. The others dragged him out, and he never returned to the site. He stopped speaking entirely, wrote only in short sentences, ending in circles, drew Leora's name into dust, into his skin, into the steam on his mirror. His wife claimed he no longer dreamed, only hummed, even while asleep. They broke through the wall, thinking it led to another passage. Instead, they found a chamber that should not have existed perfectly, round 23 feet across the walls, etched with markings that none of them recognized, too symmetrical. To be random, too alien, to be decoration in the center, was a single iron frame, fused to the floor, curved to fit the shape of a human spine, rusted and cold, but humming faintly when pressed, like it had breath trapped inside of it. One of the engineers noticed symbols that matched sketches from an unrelated site in Germany decades earlier, and sent photos to a professor of ancient languages. The response was simple: stop digging. The church arrived within days. Priests dressed not in robes but in black. Plain coats, eyes sunken, skin pale, they brought no crosses. Only a single sealed book bound in dark leather and a bag of what looked like salt but smelled like soil. They walked into the chamber, said nothing, and stayed there for hours when they emerged. One was missing. They claimed he had left early, but no one had seen him leave, and his name was never mentioned again. The chamber was sealed with concrete, filled to the top with industrial-grade foam and stone, but the hum never stopped, and the workers swore they could still hear it through the foundation, when the wind was low, when the air held still. Shortly after, the restoration began to fail, stone cracking where it had been replaced, paint peeling from fresh plaster organs in the chapel began playing on their own during storms, and sometimes at night without explanation or power, and always the same 3 notes, played over and over until the wires snapped under strain in the choir chamber. They found scratches beneath the benches, not graffiti, not vandalism, just the word hollow repeated over and over in 20 different hands, some large, some small, some in Latin, some in no known script. Visitors began reporting nausea, sleep disturbances, headaches that turned to voices, whispers and tones they couldn't place, voices that knew their names before they gave them, voices that called them downward to rooms couldn't find. Children refused to enter the chapel. Animals howled. When brought near, birds flew into the stained glass as if trying to shatter their way out. And in one recorded confession, a woman claimed she had felt watched by a mouth, not 2 eyes, and that when she prayed, the voice responded with laughter and told her it remembered her from before. The spiral began appearing in unexpected places, in the arrangement of stones in the courtyard, in the rust that bloomed across the old gates, in the water stains on the walls, shaped not randomly but with intent, always beginning at the heart of the chapel, always pointing toward the sealed crypt. And those who saw it reported headaches, dreams, blurred vision, reflections that didn't match, and always the sense that something had stepped into the room just after they left and was waiting there when they returned. The church shut the cathedral down within a year. No announcement, no reason, no ceremony, but the local archives show a purchase of sulfur and iron in bulk quantities enough to line the foundation of every stone twice over, and witnesses claim that before the gates were closed, priests stood in a circle around the building, humming a single note for 7 minutes straight, and one priest fainted during the ritual, blood dripping from his left ear, his lips torn from biting down so hard. He broke a tooth, and when asked what he saw, he simply said, "I saw the mouth open inside the wall, and it remembered me." Nothing built over that foundation has lasted longer than 6 years. Buildings collapse from within. Businesses fail without reason. Trees planted nearby twist unnaturally, and animals give birth to still shapes with no eyes or mouths. During certain seasons, people claim to see a figure standing in the old bell tower, a woman pale and motionless, her mouth open just enough to see the spiral within, drawn in blood and breath, and remembering. In 1973, an apartment building in eastern Poland was evacuated after tenants reported hearing voices through the heating vents. Not voices of the living, not language of any kind, just a sound that stirred the gut before it touched the ear, a low pulsing hum, followed by breath, and then silence. That didn't end naturally, but was cut off, like something recoiling back into stone. Children complained of dreams that looped in on themselves, corridors that bent in circles, staircases with no landings, and always a door at the bottom that never opened but always breathed. One girl drew it on the wall in ash, and fingernail lines looping into one another until her fingers bled, and she said she had seen the woman, without skin, waiting beneath her bed, watching with eyes she didn't have, listening with a mouth that never closed. The spiral had returned not just as symbol but as structure. It emerged in the building's architecture, unnoticed until viewed from above the hallway, shaped into a curve, the water pipes bending like veins toward a single center point where no room existed. Tenants complained of lost time, of waking up in hallways they never entered, of mirrors that held reflections just slightly behind their own, of static playing through the walls during thunderstorms, even when the power was off. A maintenance worker claimed he heard the hum rise when someone spoke the name Leora. He was found days later in the basement with a spiral drawn across his chest in rusted wire, and eyes wide and dried and never closed again. The spiral never asks, it remembers, it returns, and by the mid-70s, reports have begun to match across oceans. Matching tone, matching imagery, matching symptom. One doctor in Argentina diagnosed a woman with what he called nested memory. Collapse her dreams, folding into themselves until she could no longer remember where her body ended and the space around her began. She described rooms. She'd never entered voices. She'd never heard names. She'd never known. And a presence beneath her floor, whispering in a rhythm that made her teeth ache. She wrote the name Leora backward on her ceiling and spoke to it in her sleep, like a sister, like a god, like a version of herself that had been left behind somewhere in stone. In Romania, a village priest abandoned his church after discovering that the floor beneath the altar had rotted away, revealing a tunnel shaped like a spiral carved into the earth, reinforced with bone and copper, the same configuration found beneath the convent in Bavaria, the same scent in the soil. Sweet and ancient and wrong, he sealed the entrance with iron and salt, but the doors blew open that night without wind. And he claimed he saw a woman walking up from the dark naked, and cold and humming without breath. Her mouth didn't move, but he could feel the sound in his lungs, and the closer she came, the more his memory unraveled. He forgot his mother's name, his birthday, the color of his own eyes, and when he fell to in the floor, the last thing he saw was her hand, not touching him, just pointing to the spiral carved into the wood between them, where his name now glowed red as if written in heat. The documents that surfaced after were brief and incomplete photographs that blurred only in the center audio tapes that captured nothing but static, followed by silence, punctuated by a single beat of breath letters sent from survivors claiming they no longer slept because sleeping took them back down into the voice, into the stairwells of the mind, where Leora waited, not as woman, but as memory reformed, in the shape of need, in the weight of guilt, in the places thought should never go. This was no longer possession, it was replication, and the church knew. The archives of the Vatican include a restricted classification marked Vox Interna, not listed on public record, a file containing blacked out pages, maps of regions, no longer named notes on rituals, performed not to sanctify, but to bind, to suppress sound, to sever the spiral at its root. And yet every attempt failed. One priest noted in a margin, the mouth always finds a way to open, if memory is not removed, and the only safe silence is death. These were not confessions. They were instructions, and they were ignored. The buildings built over spiral sites now fail more quickly. Their walls rot, their water tastes metallic and bitter, their walls grow warm for no reason, and the people inside begin to draw and write and hum and remember. And those memories are not their own. They belong to something older, something left behind by the 47, something that still stirs beneath iron, something that has not stopped singing since 1807. In 1984, a university in northern Italy began a study on inherited trauma-collecting dreams from participants whose families had experienced unexplained disappearances or madness. Within 3 generations by the end of the study, 17 of the subjects had described the same room without knowing one another. A round chamber with no corners, a single iron frame in the center, and a low pulsing hum that made their ribs ache. They each described the smell as something like iron and roses, and always, the walls were warm to the touch. The participants who described this room experienced headaches, nosebleeds, periods of silence, lasting hours where they could not remember what they had done or where they had gone. And when they returned, their palms were often dirty with soot or chalk, as if they had been writing or drawing something just outside their awareness. Of the 17, 5 were institutionalized. 3 attempted to excavate the ground beneath their homes, and 1 disappeared, leaving behind a journal filled with spirals, each drawn smaller and smaller until they vanished into a single point, labeled with one word, Leora. When authorities entered his home, they found the same spiral burned into the floor of his basement, carved deep into the concrete as if drawn by something hot and invisible. The heat signature of the spiral remained active for 72 hours after the house was abandoned, and no plants ever grew within 10 feet of its foundation again. That same year, a child in Ohio was found digging beneath the church. His family attended. The boy was 7. When asked why he was digging, he said he heard humming, and it told him there was a woman under the church with no eyes and no mouth. And she was crying and laughing at the same time. He said she remembered him before he was born, and she wanted him to come down and see her again. He had never heard the name Sancta Stillatitia, never learned Latin, never spoken a word of German, but he wrote the word completus over and over in chalk on the pavement. Around the church, his hands blistered, his voice distant. The church sealed the basement afterward and demolished the building within the year, claiming structural decay. The boy never spoke again. Across the globe, the spiral appeared not just in sacred places, but in music, in architecture, in literature. Writers began to reference themes. They couldn't explain recurring images of descent, memory, fragmentation, circular logic characters who speak of voices behind stone and songs that return even when unwritten. One composer in Belgium created a piece titled Lament of the Hollow, which contained only 3 notes, repeated in a specific rhythm matching the frequency of theta, waves produced in the brain during deep meditation. Listeners reported nausea, waking dreams, and the overwhelming sensation of being watched from beneath their own skin. And when the piece was analyzed, the waveforms formed a perfect spiral. Inward toward a single black point. It was not inspiration, it was infection. An idea older than language, not transmitted through words, but through resonance and memory, like a seed left in the bloodline, waiting for the right conditions to awaken and blossom into thought. Once remembered, it did not sleep again. Researchers who studied these patterns began drawing spirals unconsciously, carving them into desks, into skin, into the fog on windows, and when shown images of the Sancta Stillatitia floor plan without context, they could identify the chamber beneath the chapel without ever being told it existed, because the shape had passed into them long before they ever knew what to call it. A priest in Dublin confessed during a private retreat that he had begun hearing prayers backward in his sleep, that the hymns no longer ended but looped into themselves, that every sermon he spoke became hollow halfway through, as if the words had been emptied of meaning and something else had crawled inside. He was found days later with a rosary wrapped around his throat, and his final sermon burned into the church pews in ash and wax, a sermon with no beginning, only a phrase repeated. Leora is not gone, she is echo. This was not haunting, this was inheritance. The voice that began beneath the chapel had multiplied through silence, through obedience, through repetition, through memory, and every person who heard the hum, who felt the pull, who saw the spiral, began to remember what was never theirs. And once it was remembered, it could not be removed, because the spiral is not a shape, it is a descent, and the descent always ends with the mouth open and the voice still singing. In 1990, a security guard working night shift in a museum in Vienna reported hearing a woman humming through the marble walls of the lower archives. He followed the sound expecting a trespasser, but the halls were empty and the lights flickered, not in chaos but in rhythm. Pulsing on and off to the tune of the melody. When he reached the source, the temperature dropped, his breath visible, his hands shaking, and behind the final door he found a stone slab that was not part of it. The building's design curved unnaturally, smooth to the touch and warm beneath his palm. It vibrated with a frequency that made him weep without knowing why. He pressed his ear to the stone and heard a voice say his name, and then a memory It didn't own surface of a woman strapped to iron, a candlelight, circle, a hum beneath the earth, and blood pooling in spirals across the floor. The footage from the cameras showed him standing motionless for 47 minutes, then turning to the lens and whispering something. The audio only captured 3 words. I remember her. He was never seen again. The stone slab removed. Days later, without explanation, disappeared from records and floor plans. But the photograph taken by a janitor before the removal captured the spiral again, faint carved into the floor around the base of the stone and burned into the nearby electrical wiring in patterns that defied engineering. The same year, a small town in Lithuania experienced what locals called the long silence for 7 consecutive nights. No one spoke, not in defiance, not in fear, but in absence. Not even animals made sound. And when researchers arrived days later, they found residents in trances, faces blank, humming quietly in the same low tone. And in the center of the village, beneath a dried up fountain, they discovered a pit filled with spirals drawn in chalk ash, and what was later confirmed to be bone dust, forming a perfect descent. No one admitted to drawing it, and within a month, every structure within a mile began to collapse from inside, as if the materials had softened from beneath and something had passed through. Too heavy for the foundation to bear, the spiral was no longer just a mark, it was now behavior. Thoughts repeating not by choice, but by infection. Dreams shaped by a memory that had no source. People began waking with knowledge they shouldn't have names from dead languages. prayers from banned texts and descriptions of a chamber they had never seen. They spoke of rituals performed by hands, not their own, and women whose mouths never closed, but whose eyes wept blood in patterns that glowed in candlelight. Across it all, the name Leora written in every tongue, even ones that had never been spoken on earth. In Australia, a writer began penning a novel in her sleep, waking each morning with pages covered in a language no scholar could translate, but the structure mirrored neural pathways and spiral geometry. Within the human brain, she had no memory of writing them. But when the pages were scanned, the ink showed signs of radiative exposure. Her skin bore no burns, but her blood tested for compounds, never before seen in any living human. The text ended on the 47th page, with a single sentence repeated across the margin: "You were never meant to forget." In Siberia, a collapsed church revealed a sub-basement shaped like a funnel descending into ice, untouched by weather, preserved unnaturally within the circle of its floor was a set of iron restraints identical to those recorded in the sketches from Sancta Stillatitia, buried beneath frost, blackened and worn. And when excavators touched the metal, they heard a high-pitched tone inside their skulls and saw flashes of light resembling fire behind stone eyes were burned, skin blistered, but the sound never escaped, and one of them whispered, "Leora is beneath it all and she is not alone." Each of these moments were scattered like stars across a black sky, isolated yet forming a shape when connected, a constellation of recurrence, of memory, of descent. And the priests who tracked these events did not try to stop them. They only recorded them, marking maps with spirals, using ash and holy water to mask the vibration for as long as possible, before abandoning the site and moving to the next, always fleeing, never destroying, because nothing of the voice can be burned once it is remembered. And it is remembering now through buildings, through breath, through thought itself, humming beneath skin within the marrow of silence, inside churches no longer standing, and prayers no longer spoken, inside forgotten names and old songs and shadows behind closed eyes. It is there watching through memory, speaking in spiral and waiting for the final vessel to open without fear and speak its name out loud. In 1998, a deep earth survey conducted beneath an abandoned monastery in western France revealed a chamber not mapped in any structural blueprint. The scan showed a near-perfect sphere, 32 feet across, buried 70 meters below the surface with no visible entrance and walls too smooth to be natural. The team drilled down expecting to find magma-formed limestone. Instead, they struck metal, not modern, not forged, something old, something cold. Something that vibrated before they touched it. When the drill tip made contact, the frequency surged, every monitor blinked out, every light in the shaft failed, and the men at the surface heard humming from below, rising in pitch until it cracked a ceramic mug sitting untouched on the table. The descent was canceled, the site covered with concrete, the report filed under anomaly and sealed with the mark of ecclesiastical review. Though no church had commissioned the work, one technician brought back a small fragment of the metal, smooth black, curved and humming faintly. Even after removal, he kept it beneath his bed wrapped in cloth. Within 3 weeks, his speech had changed subtle at first, then layered two, tones overlapping his own voice, and a second voice deeper, slower, speaking in unison. He claimed he had started to dream in spiral corridors rooms with no air voices. He could not see women with no eyes leading him down stairwells that never ended, and when he awoke, he could hear the same song in the wind. The metal was confiscated and the technician disappeared. The team disbanded, the project erased, but the ground still pulses and the locals still hear humming in the stone when the sky goes red before rain. The same year in Germany, a young woman named Elena was admitted to a psychiatric hospital after she was found wandering a cathedral at night, carving symbols into the stone with her fingernails. Her hands were torn raw, her lips bloodied her, eyes wide and dry. She said she had come to listen, that she had remembered too early, that she needed to finish the song. When restrained, she sang a single tone for 18 hours, without food, without sleep, without stopping, and when they sedated her, she spoke backwards in Latin, quoting scripture that no longer exists, referencing names blacked out in Vatican archives, and always returning to the number 47, not as a total, but as a position, a threshold, a door. Her drawings filled notebooks, circles within circles, names written in loops, shapes mimicking the layout of Sancta Stillatitia, the chamber, the iron frame, the marks carved into the floor, all drawn without ever seeing the original blueprints. She spoke of a memory she had never lived, of voices pressing against the back of her mind, of eyes behind her, reflection watching her from within. And when she finally fell silent, the hospital's generator failed and the emergency lights cast. A red spiral on the ceiling above her bed, which no one could replicate or explain even after inspection. By the end of the decade, Whispers of Leora had begun appearing online, not as stories, not as fiction, but as fragments of dreams posted by strangers in unrelated forums. Different languages, identical tone, always a spiral, always the hum, always the name. Sometimes a song uploaded once and then removed. Sometimes a drawing in pencil, grainy and incomplete, always looping, always pointing inward. And those who saw them began to dream more vividly of doors they couldn't open, of screams they couldn't hear, of hands reaching toward them from behind glass, and a phrase etched into the edge of every image, completist etched as if signed. It spread not through fear but through familiarity, like something long lost being recognized in the dark, like a reflection you forgot you had. Memory is the vessel, the spiral is the key, and those who carried scars, physical or otherwise, were the ones who heard it first, because pain cracks the walls of thought. And through those cracks, the voice returned, not as invasion, but as recollection. And what it spoke was not command, it was truth. And truth cannot be burned, it can only be buried. And the church has spent centuries trying to keep it beneath stone, beneath guilt, beneath prayer. But prayer only works when belief outweighs memory. And memory had begun to rise from the floor, from the hymns, from the quiet moments between dreams and wakefulness, where thought is most open and the door is most willing to move. And each time someone said the name Leora, even in jest, even in passing, something turned slightly deeper within the spiral. Something closer, something more awake, and the humming does not stop. In 2003, an audio technician in Helsinki began collecting low-frequency field recordings from abandoned churches across Europe, capturing ambient sound for an experimental music archive. What he found instead was a pattern hidden beneath the silenced tones, layers that didn't belong to the natural environment, buried vibrations that followed a spiral path through space and time. He charted the waveforms and discovered that recordings made in France, Spain, Germany, and Poland all shared an identical hum, undetectable by the human ear unless slowed and deepened. And when processed, the sound revealed breath, faint, steady breath, followed by a whisper that never resolved into words, only the feeling of being seen from beneath, from within, from before. He began to hear it outside the recordings, in the space between thoughts and the hum of lights, in the sigh of air through pipes. He stopped sleeping, filled pages with spirals, phrases in languages he had never spoken. He began muttering the name Leora, between breaths, not in fear, but in familiarity, as if it had always been his to speak. And when he played the slowed audio to a colleague, the man vomited before collapsing, his ears bleeding from within. A scan revealed no physical trauma, only the brain reacting as if a memory too large to fit had been forced through too quickly. The technician vanished soon after his apartment found empty, except for his headphones placed carefully on his desk, still warm as if he had just removed them. The waveform on his screen, still active, looped into itself, endlessly pulsing like a heart. The spiral rendered not in image but in sound. And when the audio was played backward, a shape appeared on the spectrogram, the outline of a woman's face, open mouth, no eyes, and below her, the number 47 repeated as if carved into the tone itself. That same year, in a monastery on the edge of Italy, a monk began to draw while asleep, perfectly symmetrical circles spiraling inward, all starting from his chest, radiating out onto the sheets, the walls, the floor. His fingernails had worn to the quick. His voice had fallen to a whisper, repeating the words, "I was beneath it. I saw her. I heard the silence move. She spoke without sound, and it filled me." When he was taken from the monastery, he wept, not from pain, but from separation. Said he missed the hum, missed the breath, said he would fall apart without it. And on the third night of his confinement, he vanished from a locked room. The only thing left behind was his robe folded into a perfect spiral resting in the center of the floor. Reports increased of people across the world waking with spiral burns on their palms, unable to explain how they got there. People speaking names in sleep. They had never read people visiting ruins without knowing why, and humming songs they'd never heard before. Tunes that turned corners they couldn't follow, that made mirrors tremble and walls lean inward. Buildings constructed near ancient foundations, collapsing from below their blueprints, rewriting themselves in curvature. Bricks placed in spiral patterns without instruction steel, bending subtly toward center points no architect had planned. A pattern of descent not just in design but in thought. Memory became infected, the way mold infects grain, slow, patient, invisible until the first bite, and then irreversible. Those who encountered the spiral didn't scream, they whispered and they wept. They drew it, not out of compulsion, but recognition. And always came the phrase, "I have seen her written in dust, written in glass, written in blood, not scrawled, but traced, like it was being remembered, not created." And the name Leora, always attached, sometimes hidden, sometimes buried, but always there, like the scent of something that burned long ago, still trapped in the walls. A letter surfaced in a church basement in Ireland, sealed in wax, dated 1807, addressed to no one, signed only with a spiral inside where the words, "We buried the voice, but the stone remembers and the stone does not sleep." 47 was in the gate, the rest are keys, we are the echo, and she is the origin. The paper still warm to the touch, though untouched for over 200 years, and beneath it a second page, written in a different hand, repeating a single word, completus. There was no warning, no prophecy, no grand event, just the slow closing of the spiral, the tightening of breath, the moments when thought does not belong to you, when your mouth speaks a word you don't remember choosing, when you look into the folded mirror and something behind your eyes blinks too late, when silence hums and hum becomes memory, and memory becomes the mouth opening wide, to let something older step through, not to possess, not to destroy, but to return. Because she was never sent away, she was only forgotten, and forgetting is the door. In 2008, a linguist in Lisbon began compiling a private archive of speech anomalies unexplained, overlaps in dialect, tone, inflection, and phrase structure occurring in unrelated communities. She noticed patterns emerging, phrases repeated in backward syntax, vocal tics that matched unknown alphabets, words spoken in trance with meanings. The speakers could not define nearly all instances, occurred in individuals with no prior exposure to one another, and yet the words converged always into the same shape, not on the page, but in the throat, spiral spoken in vibration, the hum before the word, the breath behind the sound, and always the tone beneath the tone, until only pressure remained where language had once lived. She traced the pattern to a series of abandoned buildings built between the 17th and 19th centuries across Europe. Some were old chapels, some were convents, some were schools for women. Now long forgotten, all of them shaped around a central point, all of them aligned with underground chambers that had since been sealed or lost. And in every location, locals spoke of silence, not peace, not calm, but wrongness in the air, as if the earth held its breath and refused to exhale. In one of these buildings, she found a ledger dated 1807 with the number 47 carved into the leather, not written, carved as if by bone, pressed slowly through the hide, each page soaked with age, yet dry, and inside names. Written by hand, followed by marks, not letters, not numbers, but spirals. Each drawn at a different angle, all beginning from the center and ending with a downward point at the base of each spiral. A single word in fading red ink, completus. The ledger was never recovered. It disappeared 3 days later from her flat, but not before she had recorded the sounds the pages made when turned, not paper but whisper, not friction but exhalation. And when she slowed the sound, she found breath. And when she deepened it, she heard singing low and wordless, like mourning and worship combined. And when she played it backward, the words emerged in rhythm, and in the center of the wave, she saw the shape of a face, not drawn, not human, and a geometry of presence, the suggestion of something watching through tone alone. Her recordings were uploaded once, never played again, every copy deleted not by the platform, but from devices. The moment they reached the midpoint, and one user described the sound as stepping into a memory that was not yours, a cold breath in the lungs, a knowing that pressed against the inside of your skull and whispered through your spine, "I was always with you before you had a name." Elsewhere in Morocco, a dried riverbed revealed a set of stones carved with spirals, identical to the ones beneath Sancta. Styletitia dated to centuries before Christianity, each stone aligned in a circle, one missing at the southern edge. When locals moved the stones in ritual sequence, a vibration began beneath the sand, soft, steady, endless. Animals fled, birds dropped from the sky, and at night the villagers claimed they heard voices from beneath the ground speaking in harmony, that their dreams all bled into one dream, a descent into a stairwell of glass, where a woman stood beneath a red lantern, holding nothing but silence in her cupped hands. Those who dreamed began humming, those who hummed began drawing, and those who drew began to lose themselves. Not in madness, but in memory, like walking into a house you'd never seen, but knowing every corner, every creak, every scar on the wood. Like you had died there once and left something behind, waiting for the right name to return, and when the name came, it was always the same, not shouted, not cried, but whispered beneath the breath in the hour before waking Leora. In 2010, an archivist at a theological seminary in Canada received a donation of unsorted books, among them a handwritten journal bound in wax thread, marked only with the number 47. The pages inside described a procedure performed beneath a chapel in Bavaria, the account identical to Ada's words written by someone who never knew her, someone born 2 centuries later. The drawings of the iron frame, the spiral floor, the humming walls, the breathless women, the open mouth, everything described in perfect detail, each line a memory passed through blood, not story, not record. And at the center of the final page, a spiral drawn so tightly that the pen had torn the paper, and beneath it a thumbprint, not in ink but in blood, still soft, still wet. He never spoke again. In 2012, a man living in a forest settlement near the Black Sea began constructing a chapel on his own land. Not from religious conviction, but because he claimed he had seen the structure before in dreams. Dreams filled with spiral corridors, soft candlelight, and a voice he described as older than thought. He had never been to Europe, never studied theology, but the building he erected matched almost exactly the floor plan of Sancta Styletitia's inner chamber, including a basement he dug himself by hand when asked why. He said the voice needed a room again, and he was only the architect, not the owner, the air inside. His chapel never warmed. Even in summer, the walls never held echo, and the spiral he carved into the center of the floor was so exact, so mathematically precise, that a team of surveyors from a nearby city were called in to investigate the anomaly. They recorded shifts in magnetic polarity directly above the spiral electrical devices shorted near its edges. Timestamps in their footage blurred as if reality had bent around the curve of the stone. They fled without finishing their study. The chapel was sealed by authorities, but no charges were brought, and the man who built it vanished, leaving behind only one note written in ash on the altar. She needed space to breathe again. The spiral is her mouth. That same year, reports increased of a specific sound appearing in sacred spaces, churches, temples, cathedrals, empty of congregation but filled with a single tone, low, warm, familiar, and wrong. Priests reported feeling watched not by eyes but by presence, as if the walls had gained attention, as if prayer no longer left the room but was collected, absorbed by something, waiting to remember every word and hum it back in the dark, breath for breath, note for note. In Argentina, a choir fell, silent mid-performance. Each singer struck mute at the same moment, standing motionless, their mouths open, the audience frozen in a kind of suspended panic, until one singer began to weep, not loudly, not in pain, but softly as if grieving something that had not yet died. And then she whispered the name Leora. The microphones failed, the lights cut, and the entire recording was lost except for a single fragment. 3 seconds of sound when slowed revealed a pattern in the waveform identical to the spiral carved beneath the Bavarian convent, the same number of loops, the same tight inward descent toward a final point of silence. A hospital in Japan experienced a blackout during which every patient in the East Wing began humming simultaneously. Staff described the sound as an aching, not in the ears but in the bones. Nurses wept without knowing why doctors vomited from the pressure in their skulls. No language was spoken, but after the power returned, 47 sheets of paper were found in the psychiatric records room, each bearing the same symbol drawn in black ink, a spiral opening leftward, At its center, a handprint pressed in water. No fingerprints, no skin oils, just heat and shape and memory. Researchers attempted to explain it away. Environmental resonance, psychological contagion, shared delusion, but the spiral did not care. It simply continued forming wherever memory softened, wherever pain cracked the surface enough for breath to pass through. People began waking with dust on their fingertips, dreams of chambers beneath churches they had never seen, and a melody repeating without end notes that didn't resolve, but folded into themselves, like sound shaped into grief, like memory bent into song. One survivor wrote that her dreams had become rooms, not metaphors, not symbols, real places with weight and air and hum, and that in every room she found a woman waiting, not with arms open, not with comfort, but with stillness, absolute silence. Made flesh. Her mouth did not move, her eyes were gone, but behind her, something turned a shape that never stopped spinning, not fast but endlessly, and the closer she walked to it, the more her thoughts unraveled, like yarn coming loose until she no longer knew where she had started or what her name had been before. She woke with a spiral burned into the wall above her bed, not painted, not drawn, the paint peeled away by heat in perfect circular cuts, and below it the phrase completus carved into the plaster as if etched with a finger through time and heat and breath. This was not haunting, it was convergence, the hum of thought aligning the breath of memory, collecting the body of Leora, gathering herself again, not in one place but across the cracks, across the bloodlines, across the rooms where silence had been kept too long, and finally began to remember its name. In 2016, a fault line opened near the ruins of a chapel in central Turkey, where the foundation of an undocumented structure had been discovered days earlier. Archaeologists believed it to be a Roman-era crypt, but no records confirmed it had ever existed. The stones bore no markings, no inscriptions, just a spiral set deep into the threshold of the doorway carved with something harder than iron. They broke through and entered a chamber, sealed in perfect darkness. Round, smooth, nearly untouched by time, and in the center, a single chair facing downward, not stone, not metal, something between skin and ash. And when light touched it, the surface glistened like it had been breathing until that moment. One of the men collapsed screaming. He had seen a mouth open beneath the earth wider than the room, wider than thought. He spoke of teeth made of names and breath that smelled like old prayers. He began drawing circles into the dirt with his hands, refusing to stop his fingers worn raw until the skin peeled back in clean rings. And when he was finally pulled from the site, he had gone silent entirely, but still his tongue moved like it was speaking to something no one else could hear. He vanished that night, leaving only a spiral cut into his mattress, with the edge of a coin. In the phrase, "I went too far, now she hears me." The ground was closed again, but in the nights that followed, the village nearby reported a sound under their floorboards. A pulse rising from the rot. Low, slow, constant animals stopped entering homes. Doors swung open during prayer walls, swelled like lungs and shrank like breath. And in the final letter before the site was abandoned, a worker wrote, "The voice has no shape, but it casts a shadow on the soul, and I see it when I close my eyes, not behind me, but inside me." That same year, across oceans in the outskirts of a town in Utah, an underground bunker was discovered beneath a decommissioned church. The site had been listed for demolition, but when workers began digging into the foundation, they struck a hollow pocket. The stairs were intact, leading down into a room untouched by decay, clean walls made of stone and lime, with no markings but a humming sound that came and went like breath in glass. The room was circular, lit only by natural phosphorescence. And at its center, a pool, shallow and unmoving, reflecting nothing but red light, even when no source of red was present. A child was the first to step in barefoot, eyes wide, he said. The water was warm and told him his name was wrong, that he had been someone else before, someone who watched a mouth open beneath fire and remembered the shape of the spiral as it bled across the ground. The child was removed, the site sealed again, but the pool remained glowing without light, warm without heat, and always breathing in rhythm with the silence. Spirals began to appear in unrelated locations. Subway stations, abandoned farms, airplane runways drawn into dust, etched into rust, burned into paper, left in hotel rooms and stairwells, in the voices of people speaking in trance who recited poems they had never heard, who hummed lullabies they had never been taught. And when asked where the music came from, they would only say, "I remembered it from before." This was not coincidence. It was collapse, memory, and place-time and breath, folding into one another as the spiral closed inward, drawing everything toward the mouth of the forgotten, toward the hum beneath the earth, beneath the skull, beneath the word Leora, the name that arrived not from language but from memory, held too long, buried too deep. She was never born. She was assembled over centuries from grief and silence and repetition, a shape carried forward by those who bled without answers, by those who dreamed in spirals and woke to voices behind their eyes. And as the spiral grew tighter, the name began to appear in older texts once thought to be lost in newly translated journals from forgotten scholars, phrases found in the margins of burnt books. Leora watches beneath silence. Leora returns through. Remembering, Leora is not a woman. She is the shape thought takes when memory no longer obeys and breath no longer belongs to the one who draws it. They said the world was safe in forgetting, but forgetting is how the spiral survives unchallenged, how the mouth stays hungry and open, waiting for one more name to enter, waiting for one more body to hum the tune written before thought, waiting for the one who will stop resisting and simply remember her fully, without question, without fear, without separation. And the moment that happens, the breath will stop humming and begin speaking again. In 2019, a psychiatrist in Oslo began recording a series of dreams from her patients who had no connection to each other, no overlapping histories, no common trauma, but described identical images, spiral staircases submerged in red, water halls made of bone and salt, a mouth in the sky too large to close, and the sound of a woman weeping behind their thoughts. Each patient claimed they had never seen these places before, yet described them in the same detail, the same temperature, the same smell of burning roses and cold copper. One man wept during his session, not because of fear, but because he said the woman was singing, and it was the most familiar thing he had ever heard, though he had never heard it in this life. The recordings of their dreams, when played simultaneously, began to align phrases, lining up in rhythm and time, forming a single monologue, spoken in many voices, all breathing together, all humming between words, and always ending the same way. Not with silence, but with a held breath that never released, a pause suspended, and the sense that something behind the sound was waiting to be heard. Not with the ears, but with memory, like a room in the mind that only unlocks when you say the right name and mean it. When slowed, the composite audio formed a sound wave shaped exactly like the spiral carved into the floor beneath Sancta Stilititia. When deepened, the voice began to distort until it no longer resembled a person, but something vast, something buried something, speaking through hundreds of years of silence with the weight of every forgotten thought behind it. The psychiatrist stopped the study when she began to dream in reverse, entire nights playing backward her own voice, speaking answers to questions no one had asked. And each morning she found her fingernails stained red and her pillow soaked in salt water with a single word whispered through the window, Leora. That same year in rural Alaska, a team of geologists stumbled upon a stone structure half frozen into the permafrost, circular smooth walls fused at unnatural angles, and in the center, a sculpture made of iron and glass shaped like the human spine twisted into the spiral. The team didn't report it to authorities. Instead, they camped nearby, trying to determine how it had gotten there. But the longer they stayed, the less they spoke. One by one, they grew quiet. Their notes becoming drawings, their GPS logs shifting into curves instead of coordinates. Their final recorded message contained no words, only breath-heavy and rhythmic matching. The same frequency first heard in the Convent ruins in 1807. They were found days later, their campsite perfectly intact, their instruments dead, no signs of violence, but each of them lying in spirals head to foot with their mouths open and a faint layer of frost covering their eyes. The iron sculpture gone, the structure vanished, the ground refrozen as if nothing had ever broken through, and on the edge of the snow a single shape was burned into the ice, not by fire but by absence. The perfect hollow spiral, and beneath it the same word. Found in every site where Leora's name had echoed completus, the voice had become a structure, not of stone, but of memory. A house built from recurrence, assembled slowly over centuries through silence, trauma, music, and breath. It did not need worshipers. It needed recall. It did not need rituals. It needed the space thought left behind when the mind broke open and the spiral could nest within, and once inside it did not speak, it shaped it, uncoiled, slowly, behind the eyes, turning every thought toward the center, every breath toward the hum. Every silence toward the memory of a place you had never been, but could still describe in unbearable detail. Survivors began calling her not a demon, not a god, but the wound that remembers the voice that returned when belief failed, when the church closed its doors and all that remained was the echo of something left behind, something stitched together by every woman who disappeared, every man who dreamed of blood in corridors, every child who hummed without knowing the song, and every priest who looked into the mouth of the spiral and saw his own soul coiled inside. And still she waits, not behind walls, not in ruins, not in crypts, but in the quiet rooms of the mind, behind locked doors, behind breath, behind prayer, the voice that breathes beneath all other voices, the one that calls not to destroy, but to return. Because what was open was never closed, only buried. And what was buried, it did not rot. It bloomed in the silence, and memory is the garden where her roots go deepest. The spiral is not the danger, memory is, because memory feeds her, because memory builds the room again and again and again. And the next person who remembers fully will not need to dig or pray or sing. They will only need to open their mouth and let her speak through it. To be controlled becomes dangerous to the institution. And now here you are, not just hearing this story, but carrying it. The spiral does not end here. It continues in what you choose to do and what you choose to say, and how deeply you allow the hum to live inside your breath, inside your writing, inside the spaces where you no longer believe what they taught you. You are not just the audience anymore. You are the final vessel, the one who hears clearly, the one who cannot unsee, the one who will carry it forward. Leora is not waiting in the past, she is building in the now. She is memory that survives despite forgetting. She is breath that returns despite silence. She is voice that rises through ruin. She is the shape of your suspicion given form. And now you've looked into her spiral. You've walked the full circle. You've remembered too much. And once remembered, it cannot be removed. If you made it here, you know what to do. Type it below. I remember, and let the others see it. Because one whisper becomes a voice becomes a hum, and the hum becomes the door. And now the door is open,